A Boeing 777 carrying 282 passengers and crew is approaching the runway after a long flight. Everything seems routine until, suddenly, the pilots attempt a go-around. Despite the command to increase thrust, the engines remain at idle. The aircraft, instead of climbing, begins to sink rapidly towards the runway. The massive jet is now mere seconds away from catastrophic impact. Will the crew be able to regain control before it's too late, or will this flight end in disaster? This is the story of Emirates Flight 521. It was the morning of August 3, 2016, when Emirates Flight 521, a Boeing 777-300, was scheduled for a routine flight from Trivandrum International Airport in India to Dubai International Airport. With 282 passengers and 18 crew members on board, this journey seemed like just another day in the sky for one of the world's largest airlines. The flight crew was composed of two experienced pilots. In command of the flight was a 34-year-old captain with an impressive 7,457 total hours under his belt. Of those, 5,123 hours were spent at the controls of the Boeing 777, the very aircraft that they were flying that day. Alongside him sat the first officer. At 37 years old, he had logged a total of 7,957 flight hours in his career. While newer to the 777, with 1,292 hours on the type, he was still a seasoned aviator. The crew of Emirates Flight 521 began preparing for their arrival into Dubai. The flight had gone without a hitch, and for the two pilots in the cockpit, it was business as usual. Both of them were highly experienced and well acquainted with this route, as Dubai was their home base. As they neared the UAE, the pilots began running through the descent checklists, checking weather reports and adjusting the flight plan and setting up the approach. On board the 777-300, everything seemed routine. The crew began coordinating with air traffic control to ensure a smooth descent into the packed airspace over Dubai International Airport. For the captain and first officer, flying into Dubai was a familiar task, one they had done countless of times before, but even the most routine approaches come with their own unique challenges. Dubai's location in the Arabian Gulf often brings complex weather patterns, and that day was no exception. As Emirates Flight 521 neared the airport, the temperature on the ground hovered around a blistering 50 degrees Celsius, or 122 Fahrenheit, while gusty and unpredictable winds shifted directions. These challenging conditions made the landing particularly difficult. On top of this, a strong sea breeze was blowing in from the Arabian Gulf. While the sea breeze can sometimes bring relief from the desert heat, it also creates a dangerous scenario for the pilots. As the cooler air collides with the hotter air rising from the ground, the interaction leads to unstable and unpredictable wind patterns, especially near the ground. These factors combined, gusty, shifting winds and the extreme temperatures, were creating the ideal conditions for wind shear. Wind shear occurs when there are sudden changes in wind speed or direction over a short distance, and it is particularly dangerous during landing and takeoff, where an aircraft will be vulnerable due to its lower airspeed. A wind shear event can cause an aircraft to lose altitude or control unexpectedly, putting it in a hazardous situation just moments before landing. Recognizing these risks, air traffic control at Dubai International Airport issued a wind shear warning for all runways as Flight 521 was approaching for its landing. This meant that all pilots arriving and departing from the airport were on high alert for sudden wind changes that could disrupt their flight. The tower controller cleared the crew to land on runway 12 left, reporting surface winds of 340 degrees at 11 knots. This meant that the aircraft would be facing a tailwind of about 10 knots, well within the performance capabilities of the Boeing 777. But what the crew wasn't informed of was that the winds on the opposite runway were showing similar tailwind conditions, meaning that the gusts were blowing from both directions toward the center of the runway, a sign that wind conditions were unpredictable and likely tricky. While not mandatory for air traffic control to share, it was a clue that the landing might not go as smoothly as planned. At 8:36 a.m., as the aircraft descended through 930 feet, the captain disconnected the autopilot to hand-fly the final approach, leaving the auto throttle engaged in speed mode. This allowed the captain to make fine adjustments to the throttle manually, while still keeping the auto throttle armed in case a go-around was needed. However, as the aircraft continued its descent, the wind started shifting. What began as a headwind turned into a tailwind as they approached the runway. Descending at a steady 700 feet per minute, the aircraft passed through 450 feet, triggering the minimums call from the flight deck. The captain confidently called land, and the first officer confirmed with a check. Everything seemed under control, though the airspeed was reducing from 156 knots toward the target of 152 knots, well within the stable approach criteria. But as they descended further, things were beginning to change rapidly. As Emirates Flight 521 descended to 190 feet, the first officer reported a 16-knot tailwind, lift, which was unusually high for a landing, but not unexpected given Dubai's challenging weather. The captain acknowledged the report and continued the approach, still within the operational limits. At 115 feet, the tailwind had reduced to 13 knots, and the captain confirmed with a check, as the ground proximity warning system, or GPWS for short, began issuing descent callouts. The plane crossed the threshold at 54 feet, maintaining a stable profile. However, as the tailwind decreased, the aircraft's airspeed increased, causing the autothrottle to reduce thrust to idle to maintain the target speed of 152 knots. The GPWS continued to call out the altitude
50, 40, 30, 20, 10, 5.
guiding the crew to initiate the flare, typically done at around 30 feet in a Boeing 777. This time, the captain flared earlier, at about 40 feet, raising the nose to slow the descent. As the plane approached the runway, the pilot shifted focus from the instruments to the runway itself, using peripheral vision to judge the descent rate. The touchdown zone, marked by wide, white markers 300 meters from the runway threshold, is critical. If a plane can't land within this area, a go-around is required to avoid overrunning the runway. As the captain flared, the aircraft began to float above the runway, consuming more distance than expected. Adjusting the pitch to reduce descent rate, the aircraft passed the 300-meter mark at 158 knots, with autothrottle still in idle mode. 2 seconds later, a sudden wind shift from tailwind to headwind caused the airspeed to rise, but this subtle wind shear went unnoticed as it didn't trigger any warning systems. The captain applied right aileron to counter a slight roll, but the aircraft hovered just 2 feet above the runway at 165 knots, refusing to descend. The runway length was diminishing rapidly, and when the right main gear briefly touched down, the speed brake deployed, but quickly retracted when the gear lifted again. For the next 6 seconds, the speed brake intermittently activated, but the pilots were unaware, believing that they were still airborne. Realizing that they couldn't land safely, the captain decided to abort and initiated a go-around, activating the toga buttons and calling go-around while gently pitching the aircraft upward. However, the autothrottle did not engage, as the aircraft sensed it was either on the ground or hovering below 2 feet, so the thrust remained in idle. The captain, focused on the climb, missed this crucial detail, assuming that the autothrottle would manage the thrust. Their aircraft climbed to 47 feet, but with no increase in thrust, speed began to drop. As the tower controller issued a new go-around altitude, the situation grew more complex. At 85 feet, the aircraft reached its peak altitude, but its speed had fallen dangerously low to 131 knots. Misinterpreting this as wind shear, the captain called out wind shear, toga, just as the WS callouts warned, don't sink. Realizing too late that the throttles were still in idle, the captain pushed them forward, but the engines took several seconds to spool up, time they no longer had. The plane began descending at 800 feet per minute, with the first officer shouting, check speed, and audible warnings of airspeed low and don't sink. The captain raised the pitch in a final attempt to climb, but the crash was inevitable. 18 seconds after initiating the go-around, the plane struck the runway at 128 knots. The tail hit first, followed by the main gear and the right engine, which detached on impact. Fires broke out in the right engine pylon and the wheel well as the plane skidded down the runway, stopping about 70 meters off the center line. At 09:39 and 4 seconds, the captain issued a mayday call requesting evacuation. In the cockpit, the evacuation checklist was scattered from the impact, and smoke filled the cabin, cutting off communication between the front and the rear. Despite the cabin crew's efforts to control the chaos, many passengers delayed evacuation by attempting to retrieve their luggage, worsening the situation. As flames engulfed the right side of the aircraft, the crew heroically deployed the emergency slides, urging passengers to leave their belongings. Although gusty winds rendered some slides unusable, the cabin crew's quick actions helped evacuate all 300 passengers and crew in just 90 seconds. A remarkable feat that saved lives. Moments later, the remaining fuel in the aircraft's center tank exploded, killing a firefighter. However, all the passengers and crew survived, with the captain and a senior cabin crew member being the last to jump to safety just before the explosion. The investigation quickly compiled data from the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, along with accounts from pilots, cabin crew, passengers, and air traffic controllers. This thorough approach painted a detailed picture of the events leading to the accident. It was found that the go-around was executed with the thrust levers at idle, preventing the engines from providing the necessary power to climb, which resulted in the aircraft descending back to the runway. A critical factor for the pilot's failure was to recognize that the toga switches were inhibited, likely due to their unawareness that the main gear had touched down. This was compounded by their reliance on the autothrottle to manage go-around thrust, consistent with their training. This incident highlights how various elements of pilot training, operational procedures, and human factors can intertwine to create risks. While it's easy to place the blame solely on the pilots, such a viewpoint neglects important systemic issues. The investigation pointed out an over-reliance on automation, and a lack of training for executing go-arounds close to the runway when toga switches might not operate as expected. Additionally, the pilots did not effectively monitor the flight mode annunciator, or the FMA, changes during the go-around, in part due to the airline's policy that did not require callouts below 200 feet. The absence of warnings about inhibited toga switches further added to the confusion. The airline's policy favored the use of autothrottle across all phases of flight, failing to adequately prepare the pilots for scenarios where the autothrottle might be armed but inactive after touchdown. These factors converged during a high-stress segment of the flight that lasted only seconds, leading to the crash. Several recommendations emerged from the investigation. The airline was urged to enhance the flight training procedures and the crew resource management training, focusing on the importance of monitoring and maintaining composure during critical situations. Boeing was also advised to consider improvements for their warning systems and to develop more effective wind shear detection capabilities during the flare. The investigation also highlighted the issues with the emergency exit flights not deploying properly. Air traffic control was recommended to reassess the timing of communications during crucial phases, advocating for minimal interference unless absolutely necessary. In conclusion, this incident serves as a potent reminder that multiple factors contribute to serious accidents. The aim of such investigations is not just to assign blame, but to uncover the full story and address systemic issues that can improve safety. This holistic perspective is a lesson that can be applied beyond aviation to various facets of our lives. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us as we dive into more moments where human courage and resilience shine through. We are here to tell the stories that remind us of what's possible. Stay tuned for more stories that capture the power of the human spirit.